Watching a film, you catch it almost instantly. The character is lying. Something in the timing, the inconsistency, the slight gap between what's being said and what's actually happening doesn't add up, and you see it clearly, often before the story even confirms it. Then, in your own life, someone you genuinely care about tells you something that doesn't quite add up either, and you miss it completely. Not because you weren't paying attention, not because the signs weren't there. You miss it specifically because, this time, you weren't a neutral observer. You had something at stake in believing them. This isn't naivety, and it isn't a deficit in your ability to detect deception in general. Your detection system clearly works. You just proved that watching the movie. What's different in your own life isn't your capacity to notice inconsistency. It's a specific, well-documented mechanism that actively interferes with that capacity the moment you have a genuine emotional stake in the outcome. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why deception detection collapses, specifically in situations where you want a particular outcome to be true, why this has almost nothing to do with intelligence or general perceptiveness, and what actually happens to your cognitive resources the moment emotional investment enters the picture. Stay until the end, because the last part explains why this gets worse, not better, with people you trust the most. Let's start with the mechanism that explains this directly: motivated reasoning, and its specific application to processing potentially deceptive information. What researchers sometimes call motivated cognitive load. When you watch a film or hear a secondhand story, you're processing information as a neutral observer. You have no investment in whether the character or the third party turns out to be honest. This neutral stance leaves your full cognitive resources available for what's actually a demanding mental task: comparing incoming information against context, noticing inconsistencies, tracking whether details align across time, and registering subtle mismatches between stated intention and observed behavior. Deception detection, done accurately, requires real cognitive effort, active comparison and analysis, not passive intuition. As a neutral observer, that effort is fully available because nothing about the outcome matters to you personally. The moment you have genuine emotional investment in a conversation, wanting to believe a partner's explanation, wanting to avoid an uncomfortable confrontation, wanting to preserve a relationship you value, a separate, competing cognitive process activates: the unconscious motivation to reach a specific, desired conclusion. Research on motivated reasoning, pioneered by psychologists including Ziva Kunda, demonstrates that this motivation doesn't operate as a deliberate bias you consciously choose. It operates by actively directing how you search for and weigh evidence, unconsciously favoring information that supports the desired conclusion while devoting comparatively less cognitive scrutiny to information that would contradict it. This is the critical mechanism. Detecting deception and wanting a particular outcome to be true draw on the same limited pool of cognitive resources, and they pull in directly opposing directions. Accurate detection requires fully, neutrally processing all available information, including the parts that might suggest you're being misled. Motivated reasoning toward a desired conclusion requires the opposite, selectively processing information in a way that supports the outcome you want, which means inconsistencies that would otherwise register clearly get processed more superficially, explained away more readily, or simply not fully registered at all. This explains precisely why your detection ability seems to disappear specifically in personally significant situations, while remaining fully intact for neutral, observed content. It's not that your underlying skill changed. It's that a second, competing cognitive process, the pull toward a desired conclusion, is actively consuming the same resources that accurate detection requires, and in situations involving real emotional stakes, that competing process is consistently powerful enough to win. There's a second mechanism that compounds this specifically with people you trust or care about deeply. What's sometimes referred to as truth default theory, developed by communication researcher Timothy Levine. The theory proposes that humans operate by default under a baseline assumption that the people around them are telling the truth, a default that's actually adaptive in most ordinary social contexts, since most everyday communication genuinely is honest. and constantly scrutinizing every statement for deception will be both exhausting and socially corrosive. This default isn't simply weaker scrutiny. It's an active assumption of honesty that needs to be overridden by sufficiently strong contrary evidence before suspicion activates at all. Here's why this matters specifically for close relationships. The closer and more trusted the relationship, the stronger this truth default baseline becomes, and correspondingly, the more contrary evidence is required before it gets overridden. With a stranger or a fictional character, your baseline trust is naturally lower, meaning relatively modest inconsistencies are enough to trigger active scrutiny. With someone you deeply trust, the same inconsistencies need to be considerably stronger and more numerous before they're sufficient to override an unusually strong default assumption of honesty, which means genuinely real warning signs can be present and still fail to trigger the scrutiny that would have caught them instantly in a lower trust context. There's a third layer worth naming directly, because it explains why this specific blind spot tends to worsen, not improve, the longer a relationship continues. Accumulated confirmation bias. Once you've trusted someone successfully many times, each instance of confirmed honesty further strengthens your truth default baseline for that specific person, making future scrutiny require even stronger contrary evidence than it did initially. This creates a counterintuitive pattern where the people you've trusted longest and most successfully are often, structurally, the hardest to detect deception from. Not because they're more skilled deceivers, but because your detection threshold for them has been raised by years of accumulated, genuine trust. So if motivated reasoning and truth default baseline are working actively against accurate detection in personally significant relationships, what can actually be done about it, given that you can't simply choose to become a neutral observer of your own life? First, explicitly recognize when emotional investment is present and treat that recognition as a signal to deliberately slow down evaluation, rather than trusting your immediate intuitive read. Since motivated reasoning operates largely below conscious awareness, simply naming, "I have a strong desire for this particular explanation to be true," creates a brief window of conscious awareness that can partially counteract the unconscious pull toward the desired conclusion. Second, practice the explicit reframe technique, deliberately imagining the exact situation as something you're hearing about secondhand, involving someone else entirely, rather than something happening directly to you. This artificially recreates some of the neutral observer condition that allows full, unbiased processing, even though the actual stakes remain entirely your own. Third, when something feels slightly inconsistent, but you find yourself quickly explaining it away, deliberately pause and ask, "Would this specific explanation satisfy me if I heard it from someone describing a friend's situation rather than my own?" This uses the same self-distancing principle that improves judgment more broadly, specifically applied to evaluating potentially deceptive information rather than dismissing it through accumulated trust momentum. Fourth, recognize that being deceived by someone you trusted deeply is not evidence of poor judgment or naivety in any general sense. It's the predictable, structural consequence of a cognitive system that prioritizes maintaining functional, low-friction relationships over constant, exhausting suspicion. A system that works adaptively in the vast majority of honest interactions, and that specific deceivers can, and do, deliberately exploit precisely because they understand how trust accumulation works. Here's what ties this together. Your ability to detect inconsistency was never actually missing. It was demonstrably intact the moment you watched that film with nothing personally at stake. What changed in your own life wasn't your underlying perceptiveness. It was the introduction of genuine emotional investment, actively competing for the same cognitive resources accurate detection requires, combined with a truth default baseline that grows stronger, not weaker, the more you've trusted someone successfully in the past. Being deceived by someone close to you was never proof that you're easily fooled. It was proof that your cognitive system was doing exactly what it evolved to do, prioritizing functional trust over constant suspicion, in a system that, by design, makes you most vulnerable precisely with the people you've trusted the longest. If this explains something you've experienced, Tell us in the comments about a time you saw a lie, clearly in a movie or someone else's story, but missed something similar happening directly to you. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own mind, the next video is right there, waiting for you.